My name is Alina Brooks. I'm 28 years old, and the night my family threw me out with nothing but a backpack and a dead laptop was the night I began my journey to becoming a global tech powerhouse. They didn't know that the useless computer hobby my mother had just drowned in scolding Earl Grady Wasik evolutionary line of code that would soon solve a global healthcare crisis. My father called me a burden. My sister called me a dreamer. My mother called me a failure as she watched the liquid seep into my motherboard, effectively murdering the only thing I owned. They thought they were forcing me into a real job. They didn't know they were actually forcing me to find the only people who would ever truly believe in me. But before I show you how I turned that betrayal into a $1 million licensing empire, I have to ask, have you ever been made to feel small by the people who were supposed to help you grow? What time is it for you, and where are you watching from? I want to see how many of us have had to lose everything to finally find our worth. The story of how I became the person they now see on the news started right here, at the end of our mahogany dining table. It was Sunday evening, and the house smelled like a roast beef engagement. To my left, my sister Allison was checking her hospital pager, radiating the hero energy my parents worshipped. To my right, my brother Ethan was scrolling through stock market updates on his phone. In their world, I was the outlier, the ghost in the hoodie who sat in the dark clicking buttons while they did real work. "You're 28, Alina," my father said, his voice a dangerous, low growl that made the silverware rattle. "We've fed you, housed you, and watched you waste your time on those screens for long enough. It's time you stop playing and start living. If you won't get a job like your siblings, then you aren't welcome at this table." I looked at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted total him that, clicking, Heherd wasma building ganar kike sharethet could predict cancer cluster speferethe happened. I wanted to tell him I was so close, just days away from a finished build. But the words died in my throat as my mother reached for the teapot. I thought she was going to pour me a cup to calm the tension. Instead, she stood up, walked over to my open laptop and tilted the pot. I watched in slow motion as the tea hit the keys. The screen flickered green, then white, then went black with a faint, dying sizzle. "There," she whispered, her face tight with a twisted kind of love. "Now you have a reason to go outside." I didn't have $1 million in the bank. I didn't even have a functioning computer. In that moment, I had exactly $14 and Arrowine machine. I thought about the encrypted backup drive sitting in my pocket, the one containing the 90% of the program that would eventually make me more money than my father had earned in his entire lifetime. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. I looked at their faces, the disgust, the pity, the triumph, and I realized they didn't want me to succeed. They wanted me to submit. I picked up my backpack and walked out into the rain. I didn't have a plan, but I had a friend. That night on Naomi Carter's cramped living room couch, while her mother Helen brought me blankets and treated me like a daughter, I did the impossible. Using a borrowed computer and pure, cold-blooded determination, I finished the code. 2 months later, I wasn't for sale. I didn't take an acquisition deal. Instead, every major healthcare corporation on the planet was lining up to license my mind. I went from being homeless to being the person who owned the infrastructure they all needed to survive. Wait until you see the footage from the global gala. The look on me father's face when he realized that the loser, he evicted Wasno, the woman he needed an appointment to speak to. That's a moment I'll never forget. Growing up as the black sheep in a family of high achievers isn't like the movies. There are no sudden dramatic blowouts until the very end. Instead, it is a slow, steady erosion of your worth, one Sunday dinner at a time. My sister, Allison, was the familess walking miracle. She'd come atop the table smelling off hospital and typestick and moral superiority, regaling us with tales of 12-hour shifts at Georgia State and the lives she'd helped save. My father would look at her with a kind of reverence he never showed me, nodding as if her nursing scrubs were a suit of holy armor. To him, Allison was tangible. She was a hero. She had a badge, a schedule, and a supervisor who could vouch for her existence. Then there was Ethan. At 24, my younger brother was already the family's financial pillar. He spoke in the language of dividends, market volatility, and high-stakes trades. My mother would practically glow when he mentioned his latest bonus at the bank, treating his investment tips like gospel. Ethan was provider, the one who proved the Brooks bloodline was destined for the upper class. Together, they were the golden siblings, the nurse and the banker, the two halves of a perfect parental dream, And then there was me. I was the ghost in the upstairs bedroom, the one who lived in Theglow of a dual monitor setup and spoke a language that sounded like gibberish to them. To my father, my work wasn't work. It was a hobby I refused to outgrow. Every time I tried to explain that I was developing an AI-driven diagnostic layer, something that could analyze a patient's history and catch oncology markers faster than any human nurse, Allison would offer a tight, condescending smile. "That's cute, Elle," she'd say, "but in the real world, patients need a human touch, not an algorithm." My father's disdain was less subtle. He didn't see the lines of code that were quietly revolutionizing healthcare data. He only saw the fact that I didn't have a morning commute. He saw a daughter who wore hoodies instead of blazers and who hadn't contributed a single physical thing to the house. The contrast was a constant, suffocating weight. My siblings' successes were loud, visible, and celebrated with champagne. Mine was silent, invisible, and buried in an encrypted drive that no one in that house cared to understand. They spent years waiting for me to snap out of it and ask Ethan for a job at the bank or follow Allison into medicine. They didn't realize I was already doing both, just from a perspective they were too rigid to see. I was the burden who sat at the end of the table, listening to them plan a future that didn't include me. But as I sat there, watching them beskin each other's approval, I knew something they didn't. I knew that the world was changing, and that the very things they mocked me for were the things that would eventually bring them to their knees. The tension had been building for years, a pressure cooker with the valve taped shut. They saw my silence as a sign of failure, but it was actually the sound of a countdown. I was days away from a breakthrough hat would make my brother's bonuses look like pocket change, and my sister's manual charts look like relics of the Stone Age. I just had to finish. But as my mother stood up with that teapot, eyes cold and determined, I realized I had run out of time. The war for my future wasn't going to be won in this dining room. It was going to start on the street. The sound of a deadbolt sliding into place is the loneliest sound in the world. It's a sharp, metallic click that signals the exact moment you transition from a daughter to a stranger. As I stood on the sidewalk, the rain began to fall in that steady, persistent way that feels less like weather and more like an insult. Behind me, the house I had lived in for 28 years sat like a fortress, its windows dark and its heart closed. My father hadn't just kicked me out. He had effectively deleted me from the family directory. I looked down at the backpack slumped at my feet. Inside was a change of clothes, a charger for a machine that would never turn on again, and a laptop that currently smelled like a tea shop trash bin. My mother's gift of scalding Earl Grey was still dripping from the vents, a slow, sticky reminder of how quickly tough love can turn into a crime scene. To my parents, that laptop was a symbol of my laziness, a toy they had finally broken to force me to maturity. They didn't understand that by ink the hardware, they hadn't touched the soul of the work. I pulled out my phone, the screen's glow harsh against the midnight shadows of the street. I opened my banking app, already knowing what I would see. Balance. $14.22 was the reality check my father had been screaming about 4 years. Tone irrational person, $14 Sunday dad computer meant total defeat. It meant crawling back to the porch tomorrow morning, apologizing for me delusions, and asking Ethan for a job in the mailroom. But as I stood there, shivering in a hoodie that was quickly soaking through, I didn't feel defeated. I reached into the small, hidden pocket of my jeans and felt the hard, cold edges of my encrypted backup drive. That tiny piece of metal was the only thing standing between me and the bridge my father suggested I live under. On that drive sat the near-final build of a diagnostic engine that 3 of the largest healthcare providers in the country were unknowingly waiting for. It was $1 million secret wrapped in a $14 reality. The irony was almost enough to make me laugh. My family thought they had stripped me of my tools, my shelter, and my dignity. They thought I was standing there with nothing. But nothing is a dangerous starting point for someone who has spent their life building worlds out of code. I didn't need their mahogany table or their hero titles. I just needed a keyboard and a roof that didn't belong to a Brooks. I looked back one last time at the darkened house. My father's final punctuation mark, the porch light clicking off, was supposed to be my breaking point. Instead, it was the moment my vision finally adjusted to the dark. I hoisted my bag, ignoring the weight of the ruined laptop, and began the 3-mile walk toward the online person who had ever seen me for who I was actually becoming. Thorold thought I was a girl on a sidewalk with no future. I knew it was a storm waiting for a place to land. The knock on Naomi's door felt like a confession. It was 1:00 a.m., and I stood there shivering, a drowned rat of a girl with a ruined laptop and the weight of $1 million failure on my shoulders. I expected the same look I'd seen in my father's eyes, the look that asked, "What did you do wrong this time?" But when the door swung open, the only thing that met me was the warm, yellow glow of the hallway and Naomi's immediate, frantic embrace. She didn't ask why I was wet or why I looked like I'd just survived a shipwreck. She simply pulled me into the scent of lavender and old books, closing the world out behind us. "My mom already put the kettle on," Naomi whispered, taking my soaking backpack. In the kitchen, Helen Carter was moving with a quiet, practiced grace. She didn't look like a woman who had been woken up in the middle of the night by a homeless stranger. She looked like a sanctuary. She set a steaming mug of peppermint tea in front of me, no Earl Grey, Nobiternus, Andrape-Dathic woolly blanket over my shoulders. I sat there, my hands shaking against the ceramic, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was conditioned to believe that every roof had a price and every kindness was a loan with high interest. "Have $14, I rasped, my voice sounding like gravel. "And my laptop is. It's gone. I can't pay you yet, Helen. But as soon as I can find a way to get a new machine, as soon as I can finish this build." Helen stopped me with a single, gentle hand on my arm. "Alina, look at me." Her eyes were steady, devoid of the transactional coldness that defined my own mother's gaze. "You aren't a tenant, and this isn't a business. You're family. You stay on that couch for as long as it takes to become who you're meant to be. Don't you ever mention money in this house again." The first time since the tea hit my keyboard, I felt the air actually reach my lungs. My father had spent 28 years trying to convince me that I was a burden, a drain on resources, a cost that didn't provide a return. In 5 minutes, a woman who barely knew me had dismantled his entire philosophy. She didn't care about my siblings' titles or my father's status. She only cared that I was breathing and that I was safe. That night, tucked into the floral cushions of their spare couch, it didn't sleep. I couldn't. The silence off Carter's house was different from the silence of the Brooks. This silence wasn't empty, it was full of possibility. I reached out and touched my backpack, feeling the hard, square edge of the backup drive through the fabric. I had the brain, I had the code, and now, for the first time in my life, I had a foundation that wasn't built on conditional love. But as the sun began to peek through the curtains, a new panic set in. I had the software, but the hardware was a graveyard of circuits and tea leaves. I was a digital architect with no tools, and the clock on the healthcare crisis I was trying to solve was ticking louder every second. I had been given a sanctuary, but I was still a soldier without a weapon. I needed to know if Naomi's old college desktop could handle the raw processing power of an oncology prediction model, or if the dream would die on this floral couch before the world even knew my name. The sound of Naomi's old college desktop was like a jet engine struggling to clear a runway. It was a clunky, dust-covered tower that hadn't been updated in years. Viewed in that small, quiet apartment, it was the only weapon I had left. I sat on the floor, the floral couch behind me, staring at the screen as it groaned under the weight of my encrypted drive. My hands were steady, but my heart was a frantic, irregular drum. I wasn't just trying to finish a project. I was trying to perform an exorcism on a dream. Every time the internal fan whirred louder, I held my breath, terrified the motherboard would give out before I could port the data. My mother's tea had been a death sentence for my hardware, but as the progress bar slowly crawled across the screen, I realized. The soul of my work, the millions of lines of predictive logic, was still alive. For 48 hours, I existed in a vacuum of caffeined code. The world outside Naomi's window turned from gray to black and back to gray again, but I didn't leave that chair. I was rewriting the fragments that had been corrupted, my fingers flying over a keyboard that felt clunky and slow compared to the high-end machine my family had destroyed. There is a specific kind of madness that takes over when you are working on $1 million solution while having less than $20 in your pocket. It's a razor-edged focus where the hunger in your stomach is nothing compared to the hunger for the build successful message. I thought about Ethan's smug face and my father's red, screaming features. They thought they had neutralized me. They thought that by taking away my tools, they had taken away my power. They didn't understand that a software architect doesn't need a mansion to build a palace. They just need a doorway into the network. By the second night, my eyes were burning, red-rimmed and straining against the blue light. It was at the final layer, the diagnostic algorithm that would identify oncological markers with nearly perfect accuracy. This was the piece of the puzzle that several major healthcare firms were ready to pay millions for just a license. If this failed, I was exactly what my father said I was, a girl playing games in the dark. But as the clock hit 4:00 a.m., the terminal window stopped its frantic scrolling. The screen went still. A single line of text appeared at the bottom: build successful. System live. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since I walked off my parents' porch. It was done. The most powerful diagnostic tool in the industry was sitting on a borrowed, beat-up computer in a small apartment. But as I reached for my phone to check the server logs, a notification flashed across the screen that made the blood drain from my face. My family hadn't just moved on. They were looking for me. My brother Ethan had sent a single, frantic text. Dad is telling everyone you had a mental breakdown and ran away with stolen property. Where are you? Suddenly, my $1 million secret was about to collide with their lies before I even had the chance to announce my truth. Success is a quiet thing until it isn't. For 72 hours, the only sound in Naomi's apartment was the frantic hum of a borrowed cooling fan and the soft clicking of a keyboard that had seen better days. I had sent the final, compiled code to a secure sandbox for the 3 firms that had been tracking my progress, not as a daughter looking for a job, but as an architect delivering a solution. I went asleep on that floral couch feeling like a ghost, but I woke up to a world that was screaming my name. It started with a single notification on Naomi's old monitor. Then 100. I rubbed my eyes, the blue light fatigue still blurring my vision, as I opened the main industry news portal. The headline was bold, black, and impossible to ignore. Mystery developer solves the oncodata crisis, $1 million breakthrough for predictive medicine. I sat frozen as I watched the ticker at the bottom of a live business stream. They weren't just talking about a piece of software. They were talking about a paradigm shift. For years, the healthcare industry had been struggling with a data bottleneck that cost LiveSend billions in lost research. My code, the computer game my mother had tried to drown in tea, had just cut through that bottleneck like a hot knife through butter. The mystery developer handle I used, EB Alpha, was trending. Every major tech commentator was asking the same question. Who is the person behind the code that just made manual diagnostic tracking obsolete? Alina, Naomi whispered. Standing in the doorway with her phone in her hand, her face pale. You need to see this. She turned her screen toward me. It wasn't the tech news. It was a local community page from our hometown. My father had posted a missing persons alert, but the wording was a poison pill. Heck claimed I was unstable, that I had left after damaging family property, and that I might be delusional and in need of medical intervention. He was trying to get ahead of the story, painting me as a fugitive before I could emerge as a founder. He wanted Tonger that if I ever did show my face, no one would believe a word I said. But the internet moves faster than a father's spite. While he was busy typing lies on his Facebook page, the CEO of a global healthcare conglomerate was being interviewed on national television about the EB Alpha licensing agreement. This isn't just a product, the executive said. It's a miracle of logic. We are prepared to offer unprecedented licensing terms to whoever wrote these. Irony was a physical weight in the room. In one window on my screen, I was a mentally unstable runaway. In the other, I was the most sought-after mind in the medical tech world. My $14 bank balance was about to be replaced by a 7-figure licensing fee, but the cost was rising in ways I hadn't expected. My family wasn't just my past anymore. They were a threat to my professional future. If I stepped into the light to claim my success, I would have faced the people who were currently trying to have me committed. I looked at the build successful message still glowing on the terminal. The code was out. The world was watching. Now I just had to decide if I was going to stay a ghost, or if I was going to give my father the real world. Confrontation he had been begging for. The shift in a person's reality rarely happens with a bang. Usually, it happens in the quiet of a Tuesday morning over a lukewarm Q-Puff coffee. My father, Richard Brooks, always prided himself on his routine. Every morning at 7:00 a.m., he would sit at that same mahogany table, snap open the business section of the local paper, and pass judgment on the world. To him, the newspaper was the thin ledger of truth that mattered. If you weren't in its pages, you didn't exist. I wasn't there to see his face, but I could imagine the exact moment the air left his lungs. On the front page of the Business and Innovation section, there was no missing it. A high-resolution headshot I'd taken for a tech forum months ago stared back at them, sharp and unapologetic. The headline above my face read, "The Silent Architect. Local coder Alina Brooks becomes multimillionaire visionary after licensing viral healthcare algorithm." The article didn't just mention my name. It detailed the unprecedented nature of my success. It described how a girl from a quiet suburb had quietly outpaced entire R&D departments while sitting in a hoodie, working through the night. It listed the companies that had already signed 7-figure licensing agreements just to touch my code. For a man who measured worthy office buildings and traditional titles, the numbers on that page must have felt like a physical blow. I was no longer the unstable runaway or the failed daughter. I was the lead story. In the house I'd been kicked out of, the silence must have been deafening. I could see my mother, Margaret, standing over his shoulder, her hand trembling as she touched the newsprint. Perhaps searching for a trace of the delusional girl she'd tried to save, with a pot of tea. My sister Allison, the nurse, would be seeing my face on the break room television at the hospital, realizing that the hero of the family was now an employee of a system that functioned on my infrastructure. My brother Ethan, the banker, would be looking at the valuation of my licensing rights and realizing his entire career's earnings were now just a rounding error in my first quarter. But the most dangerous thing about a man like my father isn't his anger, it's his ego. As he stared at that paper, he wasn't thinking about the daughter he had lost. He was thinking about the status could gain. The missing persons post he'd put up only 24 hours ago was suddenly a liability. He had tried to paint me as a villain to save his reputation, and now the world was hailing me as a genius. My phone, which had been silent for weeks, began to buzz with a frantic, desperate energy. A text from my father popped up, that first communication since the night he slid the deadbolt. "Alina, Wes saw the news. We were so worried. Your mother and I are so proud. Come home tonight so we can celebrate as a family. We've already invited the neighbors." I looked at the screen, then at the newspaper on Naomi's coffee table. They didn't want Alina. They wanted the multimillionaire visionary. They hadn't changed, but the math had. The curiosity that burned in my chest wasn't about whether I would go back. That door was locked forever. It was about what they would do when they realized that the family celebration they were planning was about to become the most public humiliation of their lives. Entitlement is a powerful sedative. It allows people to forget the words they screamed and the bridges they burned as soon as there is a profit to be made from the wreckage. 2 weeks after the newspaper reveal, the Global Tech and Health Gala was announced. It was the event of the year, a televised celebration of the industry's newest visionaries. I hadn't replied to a single one of my father's texts, but I knew exactly how his mind worked. When the formal invitations arrived at their house, not from me, but as part of the general family of the honoree block, they didn't see it as accuracy. They saw it as a surrender. I watched from a distance, through the silent lens of social media, as the Brooks family prepared for their big night. My sister Allison posted a photo of a designer gown that cost more than 2 months of her nursing salary, captioned, "So proud of my little sister's big night. Family always comes first." My brother Ethan wastagged at a high-end tailor, getting fitted for a tuxedo, joking about managing the family's new assets. They weren't mourning the daughter they had discarded. They were polishing their image to match her new tax bracket. My father was the worst of all. He spent the week holding court at a local golf club, shamelessly rebranding himself as the mentor behind my success. He told anyone who would listen that he had used tough love to push me to the finish line, that kicking me out was a strategic move to ignite my fire. He was buying a new watch and a new narrative, convinced that when the camera started rolling at the gala, he would be the one walking me across the stage, the proud patriarch reclaiming his prize. They had no idea that while they were picking out silk ties and diamond earrings, I was sitting with Naomi and Helen in their quiet living room, finalizing a guest list that had nothing to do with blood. I watched my mother post a photo of a vintage jewelry set intended to wear, claiming it was a family heirloom for a Lena special moment. It was the same jewelry she was wearing the night she poured tea into my life's work. The audacity was almost breathtaking. They were dressing up for a fairy tale where I waxed princess, and they were the royalty, completely oblivious to the fact that in my story, they were the villains who had been edited out in the final draft. The curiosity that kept me awake wasn't about the gala itself, but about the sheer scale of the delusion. They truly believed that a designer suit could cover the stains of that Sunday dinner. They believed that showing up in expensive outfits would make the world forget they had left me on a rainy sidewalk with $14. As the night of the gala approached, the tension in the air was electric. My family was ready for their red carpet moment, but they didn't realize that the stage I had built wasn't a platform for a conciliation. It was a gallows for their egos. I looked at the 3 empty chairs I had reserved in the front row, specifically labeled with their names. To the world, it looked like a daughter's love. To me, it was a trap. I wanted them to be as visible as possible when the truth finally came out. I wanted them to be dressed in their very best when I showed the world who had actually stood by me when the screens went black. The lights of the grand ballroom were blinding, a sharp, artificial white that made the crystal chandeliers look like frozen explosions. I stood behind the heavy velvet curtain, listening to the muffled roar of the crowd and the rhythmic clicking of 100 cameras. This was the moment my father had envisioned for himself, the moment he would step into the spotlight and claim credit for the diamond he had supposedly polished with his cruelty. I could see them through a tiny gap in the fabric, sitting in the front row, radiating an insufferable, borrowed glow. Richard sat tall, his chest puffed out in a tuxedo that likely cost more than his monthly mortgage payment, while my mother adjusted her pearls with a smile that looked like it had been carved from marble. Allison and Ethan sat beside them, looking like the perfect supporting cast in a play they thought was about them. They were leaning forward, ready to stand, ready to be the Brooks family. The world was waiting to applaud. The air was thick with their anticipation, a suffocating sense of ownership that made my skin crawl. And now, the announcer's voice boomed, to receive the Visionary of the Year award for her groundbreaking work in diagnostic intelligence, Elena Brooks. I stepped out onto the stage. The applause was a physical wave, but my eyes never left the front row. I watched as my father half rose from his seat, a practiced, humble smile already forming on his lips, expecting me to gesture him forward. I watched my mother reach out her hand as if to catch a piece of my glory, but I didn't stop. I walked right past the center of the stage toward the far wing, where 2 women were standing in simple, modest dresses, looking overwhelmed by the scale of the room. Success is never a solo journey, I said into the microphone, my voice echoing with a clarity that silenced the room. But it is often a journey where the people who share your blood are the first ones to tell you that you aren't enough. For years, I was told that midreams were a burden and my work was a waste of time. I wastled to go live on the streets because I didn't fit a mold. Silence in the ballroom became heavy, a pressurized vacuum. I saw my father's smile falter. I saw the blood drain from Alison's face as the cameras pivoted, sensing the shift in the narrative. I didn't finish my code in a mansion or a boardroom, I continued, looking directly at the 3 people in the front row who were now frozen in their seats. I finished it on a borrowed couch in a 2-bedroom apartment. I finished it because when my own family turned off the lights and locked the door, these 2 women opened theirs. I reached out and took Naomi and Helen's hands, pulling them toward the podium. Naomi Carter gave me a place to sleep when I had $14 to my name. Helen Carter gave me the belief that I was a daughter worth having, even when I had nothing to for in return. Tonight, they are the ones who belong on this stage. Because without them, the world wouldn't have this technology, and I wouldn't have my life. Standing ovation that followed wasn't for the Brooks family. It was for the strangers who became kin. I stood there, flanked by me real family, and watched as my father, mother, and siblings became invisible in the very front row. They were dressed in the finest clothes money could buy, but as the world cheered for Thetwo women standing beside me, they had never looked more bankrupt. The pen felt heavier than it looked. It was a simple, sleek instrument of black ink and polished chrome. But as it hovered over the final signature line of the master licensing agreement, it felt like the anchor of my entire past was finally being cut loose. It was sitting in a glass-walled boardroom on the 50th floor, surrounded by a phalanx of the healthcare industry's elite. The CEOs and legal titans who had once seemed like untouchable gods from the perspective of my bedroom floor. Now they were silent, watching my hand with held breaths, waiting for him to grant them the right to use my mind. I didn't think about the zeros on the check, though there were many. I didn't think about the penthouse apartment I had just toured or the fact that my $14 bank balance was no relic of a different life. Instead, my mind drifted back to the smell of damp wool and the rhythmic whir of Naomi's dusty computer tower. I thought about the girl standing on the rainy sidewalk, listening to the deadbolt click into place. That girl had been terrified that her world was ending. She hadn't realized it was actually just beginning. With a single, smooth stroke, I signed my name. The room erupted into a polite, professional symphony of handshakes and exhaled tension, but I barely heard it. My phone, resting on the polished oak table, buzzed with a persistence that was almost pathetic. I didn't need to look at the screen to know it was my father. He had been calling every hour since the gala, his messages morphing from proud parent to aggrieved victim to desperate business partner. He wanted a meeting. He wanted a percentage. He wanted the daughter he had tried to delete to come back and save the family legacy he had nearly bankrupted with his own arrogance. I picked up the phone, but I didn't unlock it. I looked at the reflection of the woman in the screen, the sharp lines of her blazer, the steady calm in her eyes, and I realized I didn't recognize the person my family used to describe. They had spent 28 years trying to convince me I was a burden. In 48 hours off-coding in the dark, I had proven I was the engine. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Below, the city was a grid of light and motion, thousands of lives intersecting in a complex web of data and breath. My code was out there now, moving through the servers of hospitals and research labs, quietly predicting the futures of people I would never meet. I had built a bridge out of a betrayal. As I walked out of the boardroom, I passed a trash can in the hallway. I took the gala invitation, the one my father had sent back to me with a handwritten note saying, "Let's put the past behind us and build this Brooks empire together," and I dropped it in. I wasn't interested in a Brooks empire. I had already built my own, and the foundation was made of something far stronger than blood. It was made of the truth. I stepped into the elevator, the doors closing on the life I was supposed to have. As the numbers began to descend, I felt a lightness I had never known. I wasn't running away anymore, and I wasn't looking back. I was just Elena Brooks, and for the first time in my life, that was more than enough.